Are you looking for a wild, alien planet for your next miniature basing scheme? Are you sick of all the traditional options like deserts and forests and urban ruins? Well, the one place that you may not have been looking is under the sea. That's right, and there doesn't have to be anything fishy about it. It doesn't just have to be for deep kin. With all those exciting coral shapes, you can craft a planet that's vibrant and exotic and sure to attract Xenos filth in no time. And that's a party that my Marines won't miss out on. So in this video, I'm gonna be showing you guys the contents of Epic Basing's Coral Reef basing set and building some 32 and 40mm bases. But before we jump into that, make sure that you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop us a comment on what you would pair with this kind of alien coral planet. All right, let's go make it epic. All right, so let's start things off by putting down our magic sculpt putty. So here we're just tearing off little pieces and layering them on top of one another. And you can be pretty quick and dirty with this. You don't have to be super precise. This is just about getting a foundation on that base. All right, so next we're gonna test fit our Marines so that we can build our composition around him. And we're gonna start things off with our sea rock, which has some coral bits on there, and then another sea rock on the other side, which we're gonna pair with this corallium bit. And behind that, I'm gonna be placing an exotic coral, which resembles staghorn. And on that top shelf there, we're gonna place another sea rock, which I want to attach a sea fan to. So just put a little bit of super glue on the underside there and just gluing it on top, using a little bit of accelerator to make it stick faster if it's falling apart on you. All right, then returning to the front side, I'm gonna add another corallium bit here, trying to make almost like a little wall in the front there. And then to fill the spaces in between, I'm using a small bush coral at the back. All right, let's refit our Marine. And I'm just dipping the feet in some water so I can get a really clean imprint of the feet. And this is gonna be really helpful afterwards when we go to apply texture paint. All right, in case you missed it, let's have a look at the 40mm. So starting off by putting down some sea rocks, then some of our larger coral pieces like that corallium and this large staghorn coral, a tube sponge in the front complemented with some sea rocks. Actually, one of the things that we tried to do with these sea rocks is incorporate little micro versions of the existing corals on there so that it would make this kind of pairing really seamless and easy to do. All right, next up, we're ready to move into texture painting. So we're just using the concrete texture from the ammo lineup, and I'm gonna be spreading that fairly liberally across this base, using a smaller brush to make sure I get it in between all the cracks there. And don't worry too much if you get a little messy, you get it on some of the bits there. You can just dip your brush in some water and clean it up pretty easily afterwards. And I know this base isn't super practical for a model unless it's going to be on a flying base or something of that nature. This is really just meant to show the variety of all the corals that we got and how they can kind of combo with one another. So keep that in mind. You know, if you are going to be building a base for a model, you want to start with the model and then build the bits around it. Speaking of which, let's return to our 32mm base, and now we're going to apply the texture paint there. And you can see I'm going to be very careful here to avoid those footsteps because I don't want to get any of those texture granules onto the footprint, which is going to disrupt our connection with the model. Now, this is more of a tip for those of you who like to paint the model off the base, and if you don't care to do that, you can just leave them on while you apply it. All right, so the inspiration for this came from when I started reading the Horus Heresy series a couple months ago, and I got the book Fulgrim. One of the main battlefields in the book is this planet called Laeran, which is essentially an ocean world that's inhabited by this serpentine species, and they've got these kind of floating islands of crystalline coral, which sounded really cool. For this particular concept, I wanted to lean slightly away from that because that's one that I want to revisit when I actually go to paint the Emperor's Children, but we're gonna keep it a little bit more traditionally coral for this and focus a little bit more on like blues and purples, but we're gonna keep the tones quite soft still, so this is gonna look really nice if your army's got a more bold or saturated color scheme. All right, let's jump into the painting. All right, so let's start off with a layer of black primer. So just applying this with the airbrush and making sure to hit everything, especially the undersides of those bits. We don't wanna leave any of that white putty showing or any of the gray from the resin. Then we're gonna apply our white primer, and you can see that I'm gonna concentrate it in kind of a spotlight effect, concentrating the light in the middle and then feathering it out towards the edges. And then anything on the back side is gonna get a lighter coating so it's not quite as luminous. All right, so let's apply some color now. I'm going in with the transparent blue violet here, which is really just setting the overall mood on the base, and it's gonna be used for the ground color later. And then I'll use some magentas here to spray the brighter corals like the corallium. And you can see I oversprayed quite a bit there, so I'm just gonna go back in and clean up that flat sea fan because it's gonna be probably going in more of a blue direction later on. All right, and that's pretty much all I want to do with the airbrushing. The only goal here was just to kind of establish the mood on these bases, which I think is coming across quite nicely. And the rest of the work we can start defining with an actual paintbrush. All right, so let's start off by painting the ground color, and I want to aim for something kind of purpley. So we're gonna use ultramarine violet here, and we're gonna add a little bit of bone black to darken it. I don't want quite as much saturation. And I think I'll also take it in a slightly more blue direction. So a bit of ultramarine blue there to mix in as well. So just taking a little bit of both of those and then adding in some black to create our mix, and then just spreading that all across the groundwork of our base. Okay, next I'm going to take some dioxazine purple, one of my favorite colors, and maybe a little bit of medium blue. And I'm just going to start mixing those two together. And what I'm really doing here is I've picked a range of colors from blue to magenta, and I'm just trying to play within that and test these out as base coats on different coral pieces like this tube coral. Then I'm going to grab some white on my palette so that I can start mixing some lighter tones, and I'm going to start putting that into that previous mix there. And I might add in a little bit of mud brown here just to tone down the saturation. And this is the color that I ended up going with on the sea fans. So you can see that I'm just kind of spreading that across there. And I thought it'd be cool to create a bit of a gradient. So I'm actually gonna be using a bit of the dioxazine as well and blending that in towards the bottom end. Now, because the sea fans are such a flat shape, not only does this little color gradient help to make them feel a bit more interesting, but this blend is also really easy to do. Also, that slight fade at the top is going to help bring our eye back down into the center of the base. Okay, so here I'm trying to figure out what kind of color I can use for those little bush corals. And I'm really trying not to reinvent anything. I'm just using the colors that are already on my palette and seeing if I can mix something new from them. So I'm taking a little bit of the blue, taking a little bit of the purple, playing around with saturation, and then seeing if I can make that work. Really keeping this kind of limited color palette is going to make sure that you're not breaking the overall mood of your base. Okay, so I ended up taking some snow blue here so I can start creating some cooler highlights, and I'm mixing that into that previous purple that I just applied as a base coat to the bush corals. And I'm actually going to paint a bunch of this pretty liberally across them, which really ended up changing their overall tone to be a lot lighter, but you know, this value difference is really going to help them stand out from the darker ground. And you know, that happens. Sometimes the first color you put down isn't quite right, so you know, we gotta make adjustments. All right, so next up we want to find a color for those flatter staghorn corals, and I still want to stay within the purple range, but rather than taking it towards blue, instead I'm going to bring in this salmon color so that we're pushing it a little bit closer to orange, and we're going to test this out and see how it looks as a base coat on that shape. And I wasn't convinced that this was the right direction necessarily, so I did play around with switching up the tones slightly on the other base, but I'm going to unify it all with the highlights later anyways, so a bit of variation isn't a terrible thing. Next, I'm taking a little bit of magenta, and I'm going to dilute this down quite a bit and turn it into a wash, and I'm just going to apply that across the whole surface of that staghorn coral. It has a lot of recesses, so it should settle in there quite nicely. All right, and then we need to mix up the highlight, and I'm going to be adding some snow blue into this just to bring it towards the cooler spectrum. And again, it had a lot of warm colors into it, which was making it stand out a little too much in the base. And you can see once I apply the highlights to both of these staghorn corals, they end up getting unified a lot more. Now we're going to get into rendering the ground. So I concocted this gray mix from a combination of a lot of the other colors that are already on my palette, and we're applying this over top of that purplish wash that we had put down previously. And I like to do this in two layers. So one is kind of like a mid-tone layer, and then we'll do a highlight, which is just adding in some white or snow blue into that original mix and focusing it on the tops of those raised pieces. And again, you can do this for both the ground as well as the sea rock bits to kind of blend them together. And now to paint the most corally coral of them all. I'm talking, of course, about the corallium, and I'm going to be mixing vat orange with magenta here and applying that to the top surfaces of those corallium bits. You can see that the airbrushing has already given us a nice foundation, so these aren't even really a ton of work. We just want to bring that saturation back into it by hitting those upward facing surfaces that are kind of whitened out by that initial primer layer. And you can see those guys are really starting to glow there. And just adding a few highlights to the sea fan, really just to emphasize that perforated look. Honestly, these are so much fun to paint. And then just finishing things up by adding some highlights to those tube sponges. And then all we got to do is just apply a nice clean coat of black for that base rim, and we are all done. So you can see how using a limited palette of colors was able to keep a strong mood and achieve that soft pastel-y look to the environment. There you have it. I hope that this video has given you some inspiration to start looking under the sea the next time you need some exotic basing options. And if you're looking for the bits to level up your next project, you can check them out at epicbasing.com. And then please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel so that we can bring you some more awesome hobby content. And we would be forever grateful. All right, guys, till next time, go make it